Welcome back to Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag. I'm your host, Clint Schaffer, and today we're going to be talking with Dr. Dianna Bagnall from the Soil Health Institute. And we're going to be digging deep into that soil to understand how improving soil health can impact your bottom line. Stay tuned. Well, Dr. Bagnall, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Thanks, Clint. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Dianna Bagnall. I'm a research soil scientist at the Soil Health Institute.
Where's your your passion or your interest in agriculture? Where'd that kind of get its start at?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in agriculture, even though I didn't grow up farming, but I was a 4-H kid and learned a lot of skills in that program. I went to a junior college for a little while and ended up working in a soil science lab, as things would have it, and just couldn't get away. So finished up an undergraduate degree and a master's in soil science. I was out for a little bit and then decided to come back and get a PhD.
What made you want to, come back in and go pursue a doctorate then?
Yeah, so when I was out of my master's program, I worked as a project manager in research. And so I got to spend a lot of time working with folks who were doing great research every day and got interested in how that research gets applied in the real world. So when I wanted to learn more, I pursued an interdisciplinary doctorate. So I was working in economics, in sociology, and in soil health. So I really wanted to understand how we can take all the great research that we do and make sure it gets applied. And so when I graduated and had the chance to interview at SHI, I was thrilled because that's exactly what we do every day.
Well, so the Soil Health Institute, SHI, that's a nonprofit, correct?
It is. We're a nonprofit focused on soil health.
Nice. Now, does that go into? When we talk about soil health, I would assume that's not just everything that's in the soil, but also then the practices that are being done on that land as well.
That's right. There's really what I love about soil health is it's a really holistic concept. And you mentioned practices. We think about principles of soil health management. So the NRCS has done a great job of defining soil health management principles for things, for example, like trying to disturb our soils as little as possible, making sure that we have living roots in the soil as much as we can, as well making sure that we have residue on our soil and it's armored, and that we have plant diversity. So, of course, soils are really different in different places. I'm sure your listeners have dealt with different soil types across their regions. And then, of course, lots of differences as we move into different areas of the country. And so when we think about our soil health management, we want to align with those principles in a way that makes sense for the context that we're in.
You mentioned different soil types. We farm Mississippi river bottoms, and it's interesting. I always point out one of our fields where you go from pure blow sand down to Mississippi muck within about 10 foot, right? So it's like the two extremes. One's burning up and one's drowned out and full of water. And it's really interesting when you see the dynamic of some of these fields that are out there. Soil type changes are, that's a key valuable or a valuable aspect on yield as well. So.
Yeah, and our farmers, of course, have so much experience understanding that different soils have different yield potentials. And I think one reason that soil health resonates with people is that we also have different soil health potentials in the same way that we as humans have different kind of capabilities. So there are certain things that we can all be healthy, but some of us may have, a skill set that makes us better at one sport than another. And so in soil health, we do have to think about that context and how we can manage well, but we make sure we have realistic goals for the particular soil type that we're at. And of course, that interacts, as you mentioned, with how we manage our soils and then with the yield that we can expect from them.
So on that, it's almost the thought of farming for the soil type itself. I mean, I would assume that it has a maximum productivity level that each soil type would have. And no matter what you do, I would assume it's going to max out at some point. And it may be different than the next soil type.
That's absolutely right. And I think a lot of SHI's work has been in trying to first understand, because there's over 30 different ways to measure soil health. And in 2019, we did some work sampling 124 different long-term research sites across the continent. And our goal was to try and really understand which of all these measurements kind of help us understand how the soil is responding to management, so that we can maybe use a smaller suite and we understand how to use just a few that can tell us where we all are on our soil health journey. And so that work has been really foundational to something we're trying now, which is to locally establish reasonable thresholds. You mentioned maximums or targets, so that we know how good a particular soil can get. We have the right expectations. Someplace this works in a lot, we get a lot of questions about folks interested in soil carbon. Well, how much carbon can I get and how fast can I get it? And those can be soil types questions. They include geography and climate. And so there's just not one size fits all kind of a prescription that we can give to everybody all at once.
So I got you've sparked a couple questions here in that. So the first one I'm going to talk about is you talked about running samples and looking and quantifying a lot of these pieces. I used to pull soil cores, right, for a soil sampling company, and we did everything from 10-acre grids down to 2.5-acre grids down to pulling on soil types, right, which was in our opinion that's what we were trying to get down into, right, to understand that soil type. Are you pulling more, we're pulling like the basic information on soil when we're doing that typically, and we're trying to put together variable rate, fertilizer prescriptions or things of that nature. How much more information, is SHI pulling in a soil core, or even the depth, right? We're probably only pulling, let's say an 8-inch core. I would assume you guys are even looking at maybe some of the subsoil categories as well.
Those are all great questions. And yeah, we do certainly like to see sampling that takes into account those soil types, that natural variability in the field. And this is a really annoying scientist answer, but it depends. There are some projects that we might be in where we have a really specific science question. We really want to know about the water dynamics in this field, and we may be going down to, a meter or 2 meters. But with some of the discussion that we're having around a general soil health, I think we can stay in those top, 30 centimeters, top 6 inches for a lot of this work. And that means that we're just trying to understand how our management that we're mostly doing at the surface is affecting things over time. And one of the things we can do to help us understand that better when we know our soil type is compare our soil that we're managing for an agricultural purpose to something that really has all of the characteristics of the soil health management principles we talked about. So we might go find a field that is in really rich perennial grassland vegetation, and it's just, exactly how that soil was developed historically, and can go, wow, we find that in this soil, this is how stable the aggregates are. And so that's our goal. Now we want to get our aggregates in our farm fields more like that goal. Whereas if we went to a different soil type, we might go, well, gosh, we're doing the same test, but we got different results, even in that best case scenario. So we might scroll and take that target back a little bit for a different soil type.
So with the soil types on that piece, if you have the same soil types, but let's say in different environments, so let's say I go into a different state, but it's the same soil type, is it truly identical, or are there other factors that factor in that make it a little bit different, even from one location to the other, if you're in the same type of soil type?
That's a good question. Yeah, definitely it's going to differ based on geography. So I was raised in Texas, and we say that it rains in some of those places, like where I was raised, about 32 inches a year, and you'd like to be there the day that happens. So there's these water dynamics that are just really unique to that state, something really different that you'd see, in the Midwest. And so certainly when we're trying to understand what the best the soil can do, we need to take in all those features.
Now, as far as there's a lot of financial aspect that's tied into this as well when a farmer's making different decisions and changing practices and things of that nature. What are some of the financial pieces that you would lay out to a farmer of saying, hey, this is why soil health makes sense, or this is why focusing on soil health makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. Soil health is so holistic, and I think encouraging to think about that economics piece early on is really useful. So some of the work we've done in this area has been, just last year we wrapped up an analysis of 100 different farms, and we interviewed those 100 farmers across 9 Midwestern states, and they were in corn and soy rotations. And so what we were doing was having them sit down with one of our agricultural economists and answer questions about what they do now in their soil health management systems and what they used to do. And then we were able to compare the budgets of what costs they incurred. For example, they might be paying for cover crop seed. That's an expense. But they might have reductions in cost too, like reduced labor or reduced time in the field. And I've got a few notes here. From those 100 farmers, 97 of them said that their crops were more resilient to extreme weather. 85 said that their net farm income increased. And so for corn rotations, they increased by about $52 an acre on average. So that's an average. Some folks had more than that and some less. But about half of that value, about 24 of those $52, came from reduced expenses. So when we think about the ability to, for example, stop tilling so much to align with that principle of reducing disturbance in our soil, as soon as we adopt that practice, we immediately gain the benefit of we're not paying for that fuel cost anymore. And so improving that net farm income and reducing costs, as well as in some cases increasing yield, is one of the things we think is really encouraging, that as we do more of these, that farmers can see in their region, hey, I could be saving some money going to soil health.
Well, and you bring up, the tillage piece. I always think, that's the first thing that my mind goes to on soil health, right? Switch over to no-till, and you're going to see that soil health start increasing. As we start looking at making some of those changes on farm, we hear no-till a lot. What are some of the other practices that farmers can start thinking or associating back to soil health as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's so much there. First of all, I'll say that we do think all soils can be healthy, and there are some rotations, peanuts, for example. That's going to be a really, really difficult rotation to start rolling back your tillage on. And so we might think, well, we may be limited in that rotation to how much we can reduce tillage, but we might be able to really increase the days of the year that we have living roots in that soil if we were to use a cover crop. Or perhaps we're able to get some biodiversity by including something different in our rotation, or even including grazing in our rotation. So looking to some of those other soil health principles. And, I want to be careful because this is such a local application that, to be able to just broadcast out a particular practice is tricky. But I think all of the farmer mentors, the farmers who are out there doing a really great job of this, started small. They made sure that something worked for their individual system. They might have taken, 10 acres or 20 acres at first to see what worked for them. And then kind of anecdotally, I've also heard a lot of folks say, if you're going to reduce your tillage, really think about starting cover crops first, because a lot of the problems you run into when you do reduce tillage, you might be able to kind of stave off if you've already got some extra organic matter in your soil, if you've already got some protection on that soil surface. So there's a lot of different ways, things that can be done, but those are a few examples.
I was talking to a farmer friend of mine out in Nebraska, John Olerking, and he does a lot of cover crops, right? And it was fascinating to me to hear all the different types of. I always thought it's like you plant a cover crop, right? That's where my mind always went. You look at like fields of rye or something of that nature, right? I didn't realize that they were putting together all of these different cocktail mixes, as I think was the terminology that he was using when I was talking to him. But, different things to break up compaction, different ones to hold nitrogen in the soil, different things of that nature. How many of these different variations of cover crops are you looking at or testing or things of that nature?
Yeah, well, there's so much there. Books have been written on it, I'm sure. But I would say that, the first piece, like we talked about, is to start small and for something that's manageable. So if you've never planted a cover crop before, I think the most important thing is to see that it's doing well in your area. Maybe an agronomist or a crop consultant in your area has some experience. There can be a lot of different options, as you mentioned, but I would think about some big categories, like is it just a grass? Maybe I want to add a legume so I can get some nitrogen fixation. Some folks are talking, you mentioned different root structures there. You might want to break up compaction. And so I think diversity is big, but the first thing is we want to increase the number of days every year that photosynthesis is happening in your field, because that's how carbon is being taken from the atmosphere from CO2, stored in the plant, and then as that plant decomposes, it's going into soil carbon, and it's sitting on the surface as residue. So regardless of what kind of crop you have, you want to see that it's really healthy, that it's producing a lot of biomass, and that you're able to have that biomass stick around.
So if a farmer's looking at getting into that cover crop, we're actually on Chaffer Farms this year. We're actually trying 35 acres of a rye cover crop in some of our toughest ground, and this is stuff that we've been deep tilling for quite some time, right? Because of it's pretty wet ground and things of that nature. So we wanted to try this cover crop, and there was a lot of different resources out there. Where would you point a farmer to start with? We were lucky to have a friend that was kind of helping us out along the way, but where would a farmer go to maybe get some of that information to say, hey, I'd like to start trying, maybe some of these different pieces on my operation?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think you did everything perfect, because I think the very best outcome is that you're working with someone who kind of has a feel, and they've done this before in your area. And so when we work in a region, we make sure that we're highlighting and partnering with local farmers who've been successful. Kind of parachuting in a scientist can help sometimes, but what's really good is being able to have that network and community. So the first choice would be that there's a farmer in the area who has a little bit of a head start on you that can coach you through that. If that's not possible, local NRCS and Extension may have opportunities that, someone that you can get out there. There may be a local agronomist, a local crop consultant who has experience. And certainly we'd like to be a resource for folks in connecting the dots and making sure that we strengthen those local networks, because that's where, that's what you need. Is you don't just need to get it started. Then when you're like, gosh, I got to terminate this stuff and figure out if I can plan into it, you need someone to call.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pause just for a minute because I have two puppies that are fighting behind me, and I know they're about ready to start barking. So I'm just going to... All right. Hopefully they'll chill out now. Nope. Hold on. So sticking with the thought of cover crops and no-till and things of that nature, can soil types change as you're doing this? Like we talk about like increasing soil health or increasing the organic matter. Does that change the soil type over time? That's a
good question. Not usually. Usually we see that we're kind of progressing within a soil type towards a more healthy form. Probably what would be more likely would be the unfortunate case in which, for example, we have a soil that has a thin layer of topsoil and it's in a particular soil series or something like that, and we lose a lot of it and then it becomes something else. But that's really rare. So I would say that in general, we stay within one soil type, but we can have an amazing amount of variety in different types of where we fall in its soil health.
So it's kind of like if I started an intensive exercise program, I'm going to be a healthier version of me, but I'm still me.
Yeah, probably not Brad Pitt. I really hate to say it, but that's...
Yeah, I can't change myself into that. The other thing that your previous comment sparked that I wanted to talk about was you mentioned carbon, right? Does different soil retain carbon or store carbon differently then?
Absolutely, it does. And I think that's something that, as we think about these targets for soil health, we also think about setting good soil carbon targets so that we understand, just in the same way as soil health, where we are today and what's the best we can do.
Does different cover crops affect the carbon retention at all?
That's a good question. I think that it'd probably be a pretty complicated answer, but yes. And I think our conversation earlier about, wanting to make sure that the cover crop that you're planting is healthy and really doing well and producing a lot of biomass, and that's where our carbon is coming from, is probably what's most important. And then there may be some difference in type. So, for example, cover crops that have a lot of like legumes may tend to decompose faster and have less residue on the surface. So that can affect how much carbon is stored.
Now, even on like a no-till situation, do other practices impact that? I think of like a lot of these corn heads anymore have choppers on them, right? And they're basically little lawnmowers that are going across your entire field. Does that start impacting just some of the effectiveness of that particular no-till crop?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing that makes soil health awesome, but also can be difficult, is that it's just the whole system. You know, in the same way that our health is impacted by exercise, but it's also impacted by diet, and it's also impacted by our environment. All of that matters. So, especially when we're thinking about our implements and our practices, when we do go to no-till, we might want to be more careful about things like compaction, because maybe in a tillage system, I'm going to come out and knock that compaction out every year. But now I want to be a little more thoughtful because I don't really have that as an option in a no-till system. So all of these different pieces can be, you know, and sometimes we like to talk about soil health management systems more than we talk about practices, because you might have a situation where, yeah, you tried reduced tillage and you really struggled with it. And then we talked about earlier, maybe going in, starting with some cover crops, having some organic matter on the surface, and being able to then transition more successfully to no-till or to something like a reduced tillage system. So all of those little pieces and tweaking it to make it work for your rotation, to make it work for your location, and for the time that you have is important.
You talk about compaction, and I've worked with different farmers where they did, I think they called them tram lines, where they were basically running all the pieces of equipment in the same path, right? And the thought process is, if you're going to compact it really bad in one spot instead of across the whole field. And I remember Dad was always telling me when I was running the auger wagon in the fall, because you're carrying 800 bushel of corn across the field in one implement, that we were trying to basically create some of those tram lines during the harvest to try reducing that compaction. But that was also gave me an opportunity to throw out there, it's an auger wagon. I always have to keep reminding, the listeners that it's not a grain cart, it's an auger wagon,
Yes, I understand that can be pretty contentious, but seeing that we're a nonprofit and we don't do lobbying of any sort, I think I'm just going to have to stay out of that one.
I right down the line. That's a good place to stay there.
Yeah, I will say that to your point about compaction, I think controlled traffic is one of the ways I would describe those tram lines. Oh. And it can be a really important way to make sure that you are leaving a lot of that soil volume to be able to have the porosity that it needs. I was in Australia once doing some work with a soil scientist there, and he was saying that he had a particular farmer who had compaction troubles, and he called the soil scientist out, and they went and they dug a pit in his field, and then he also dug a pit in a neighbor's field. Actually, it was a gentleman's brother who had been doing, soil health management for a long time. And just to see the difference in the natural soil structure, and that this individual farmer was like, I've never really seen what the soil looked like before it was disturbed when it wasn't tilled. But he went away and he didn't say anything. And then he came back the next day to the scientist and said, when you left, I took my tractor and I dug a hole over in this line of trees where it had never been compacted, and just stared at and looked at that soil structure, those natural units that are developed when we're not disturbing it. And that was really powerful. And I think that being able to leave that soil to develop its natural structure that allows it to store carbon, that allows it to infiltrate water, and to prevent that compaction is critical and difficult.
Well, I know I've even seen on a lot on Twitter and different posts that pictures of folks that have been doing no-till for a long time and cover crops and things of that nature. And one of the things I've seen they do is taking pictures of the earthworm activity and just seeing just the sheer amount and the number that ends up showing up in a field when it is undisturbed. Do you see that with other critters as well? I mean, is it just the whole ecosystem that really starts building up there? Yeah,
I think there's a lot of evidence that we can see different when we change our tillage, we actually can see different microbiome effects. And it's it's interesting that we think of the structure of our soils as that backbone and the highways and the structure that provides all of the life that's in soil, what they need, and to imagine that we can kind of go through and destroy that on a regular basis and nothing will happen. I think we're seeing evidence more and more that we do need to preserve that soil structure.
Now I know water's a big piece of soil health as well, right? I mean, whether it's erosion, whether it's drainage, things of that. Where does that lie in your your research that SHI would do? I mean, are there like tillage trials and things of that nature that are taking place as well?
We haven't worked in tillage yet, but I think that in general, we have spent a lot of time measuring different indicators of water dynamics. So you've hit on a lot of it. How resistant is the soil to wind and water? That's that aggregate stability. How well is that structure holding up? We've looked a lot at infiltration, how different practices will impact the ability of water to move into the soil. In Texas with infrequent but really high intensity rainfalls, capturing as much as we can in a rainfall event is really important. And then another piece of the work that's so critical is looking at how when we increase the amount of soil carbon, because we've transitioned to soil health, we increase the amount of water that soil can hold. And that's been a really big piece of our measurements work, being able to actually then predict, hey, if I have this much soil organic carbon that I've gained, what's that going to do to the amount of water? And then what will that look like in my geography for my soil type? Will it mean that I can get another ½ inch of water, another tenth of an inch of water? I think those terms are things that farmers really have a good grasp of. I mean, if you say, hey, I can get you another 1/10 of an inch of water on, the first week of June, they don't need a dollar sign to know what that's worth.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see why you went into soil health. I mean, this is just fascinating having this conversation, all the different dynamics, right, of things that can really impact the health of the soil. We talked a little bit about it on cover crops, but this can sound fairly intimidating to a farmer, right? What would your advice be to somebody that wanted to start maybe increasing the health of their soils without maybe going clear into the deep end, right? What's kind of your best advice to get started? Yeah, well, we've mentioned today, starting small in terms of the acreage that you're looking at. I think that's always important. Not taking yourself, too far out of your depth and just taking some ground and saying, well, what happens when I start to reduce my tillage? What happens when I start to add some cover crops? And I think that, maybe having a small enough investment there that you can kind of play with it and say, hey, I looked at reducing my tillage for 3 years, and man, I did not see what I wanted to. What is the piece that I'm missing? And keying in as quickly as possible to other folks in your area who've made it a success. So I think that networking is really important. Starting small is really important, and then being willing to kind of tweak things and say, you know what, that didn't work so well, but this is a big system. It'd kind of be like saying, well, gosh, I tried jogging and I hated it, so I can't exercise. Or, I tried this diet and it didn't work, so I guess I'll just eat awfully. It's like, no, then we can get creative here about what really works for me and what's going to make sense in my situation. Well, that's exactly how I made the decision to stop jogging right there. So that hits close to home. So
well, I'm not that kind of a doctor, so I can't help you there.
There you go. So, well, Dr. Bagnall, I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to join us here on Around the Farm. I know our listeners are going to find this absolutely fascinating, and hopefully you'll join us down the road and we can continue having this conversation.
I'd love to, Clint. Thanks for your time as well.
Hey, a big thank you to Dr. Bagnall for joining us here on Around the Farm and really sharing her knowledge around soil health. And also, thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it, be sure to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe. Also, Around the Farm is brought to you by Climate FieldView. And with that, we'll see you around the farm.